I'd like to follow up on the discussion of the Endangered Species Act and briefly discuss some of the federal agencies which help administer the act, as well as some of the federal lands, the public lands on which we find a number of important species as well as endangered species. So the first of these is the National Park Service. And the National Park Service has a dual role effectively. One is to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and then also in such manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So again, they need to preserve the environment, but they also have to make it accessible to the public. And so historically, when there's been this conflict, when too much public access influences or impinges on the quality of nature, then they'll err on the side of protecting the habitat or protecting the ecosystem. So again, they do have kind of a dual role compared to some of the other agencies. And I'll also mention the National Park Service is funded through the Department of the Interior. Now, the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, is in charge of so-called quote-unquote resource lands, and resources would be anything of value to humans. So the Bureau of Land Management generally is in charge of lands that are used for mining. Perhaps there might be oil and gas reserves. These kinds of things also would be types of lands that the BLM manages. And so again, these are really considered lands that have the potential for development more so than national parks. And the Bureau of Land Management is also funded through the Department of the Interior. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've already talked about. They're primarily in charge of protecting species and wildlife. And again, they will work with the other agencies because while they're in charge of wildlife, some of these other agencies actually have the habitat within which the wildlife lives. And so there's cooperation and overlap in some of these agencies. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife is also funded through the Department of the Interior. Now, the U.S. Forest Service is in charge of our national forests, also grasslands to a degree. And the U.S. Forest Service is interesting because it's actually funded through the Department of Agriculture. So again, the historic view then of the Forest Service was that you're looking at forest as an extension of agriculture, grow the forest so that they can be cut and used as a resource. And that is still one of the values of the U.S. Forest Service and forests in general. However, they also do play a role in protecting species because, again, a lot of times around a national park, you will have national forests and other types of public lands that act as a buffer between civilization and the national parks. And again, this can be important in species management. So the forests then have a value beyond just the wood that they contain. But again, it's a whole different mentality in the U.S. Forest Service. They're all really, and again, that changes a little bit from one administration to another, but in some administrations, it's all about cutting them down. In others, they'll say, no, we need that basically to help maintain species. And again, there is this dynamic between U.S. Fish and Wildlife and U.S. Forest Service because a lot of endangered species are living on U.S. Forest Service land. And then also a wild card in this, of course, also is the Department of Defense. There are large bases which have a lot of natural resources on them. And of course, the Department of Defense is funded by the Department of Defense. And again, they actually have been pretty good, I think, in general, with a few exceptions, in trying to work with some of these other agencies and protect species and ecosystems. But again, their job is all about national defense. And so again, when there is a conflict between what they think is important to defense and in protecting the natural environment, they're going to err on the side of protection of the country and training their troops. So then looking at some of the national lands that we have then that are administered by these different groups, then certainly national parks and national monuments are both administered through the National Park Service. The so-called national resource lands that I mentioned earlier, basically mining lands and perhaps oil and gas producing lands, would be managed by the BLM, Bureau of Land Management. National Forests, U.S. Forest Service. And then also wilderness is kind of interesting in that it can be administered by a few different agencies, but wilderness areas are important because these are roadless areas. And so wilderness areas are a little different than national parks in that this is true preservation of wilderness, preservation of habitat. And there's no call in the rules for these agencies that administer wilderness to allow accessibility. So no road building is permitted in wilderness. Also really no machinery in general with a few exceptions. Occasionally they may be trying to battle a fire or something like that, but otherwise they really do not generally permit any kind of machinery in there without specific permission to do so. And again, wilderness, I think, is an important designation because that's truly protecting habitat. So one of the things that you see happen from one administration to another politically is that you'll sometimes see arguments about changing the way that our national lands, our federal lands are managed. And you'll hear this term, local control, because they'll argue that, well, people who live in the area have most access, they should have more influence what goes on there. And again, I just think really that's a euphemism for development. Basically, when people start talking like that, it's just because they want people to make money somehow off of this or develop it in some way. And I think you really have to be careful of those arguments. And again, it really flies in the whole face of what those lands are about. A national park is a national park. When I go to the Yellowstone ecosystem, it's mine as much as it is the people in Wyoming's. And I have as much say over its administration as the people in Wyoming. And in my view, that's how it should be. So I know I'm editorializing a little bit here, but I think it's important to understand that national lands are national lands, and we want to have a bigger view of their management than just the locals might have. So again, a brief overview of some of the major agencies and type of federal lands that we have.